Today in Tarkir, we get one of the wildest reanimation spells that I have ever seen, a super sweet cycle of rare utility lands, and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers. So we've reached day 3 of spoiler season, and we have some super spicy stuff to talk about today. Some lands that are going to be really good, maybe shake up Eternal format, some ridiculous reanimation, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Tarkir Dragonstorm cards. Before we do, couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Tarkir Dragonstorm. First up today, we get the Abzan member of the Mythic cycle in Perennation. And this card is kind of wild. It's 6 mana for a sorcery that says return target permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a hexproof counter on it and an indestructible counter on it. So I know at first glance, 6 mana seems like a lot, and 6 mana kind of is a lot for reanimation, but the fact that the thing you reanimate can be any permanent, and it's going to have hexproof and indestructible, making it almost unkillable in a lot of matchups, means that this card I think is actually really strong in the right deck. So if you think about this card, 6 mana, yeah, I know, sounds like a lot, but when you consider the other cards that can reanimate any permanent, like Invasion of Tevolda, Obsidian's 8 or 5 mana, you're kind of only paying a 1 mana tax. I know Squirming Emergence does exist in Standard, but you got a different drawback here, right? Where you need to get a ton of permanents in your graveyard to get it for only 3 mana. But Perennation, I would say, is like kind of a 1 mana tax for the hexproof and indestructible, and I think that giving the thing you reanimate hexproof and indestructible is so strong it's often going to be worth it. So in Standard, if you're just trying to reanimate like an Atroxa or whatever, Zombify might be better. Like with Atroxa, you kind of care about its ETB trigger. You want to draw a ton of cards with it. If it dies, you probably don't really care because Atroxa probably finds you another Zombify and you just get it back. So in some cases, it's going to be better just to use the cheaper reanimation spell. But when you consider how strong hexproof and indestructible is, I honestly couldn't find a good comparison. There's never been a creature in Magic's history that I could find, maybe I'm missing something, that just straight up has hexproof and indestructible. The closest I could find, Fleecemane Lion, if you monstrous it, becomes a 4/4 hexproof indestructible. Saw a lot of play back in its day. Actually, Perennation might be kind of a callback to Fleecemane Lion, actually. Thrawn Breaker of Silence kind of does half that. It's basically like whatever you reanimate always has a heroic intervention on it, which is absolutely absurd. So, as I mentioned before, if you're just trying to reanimate an Atroxa or a Vaultborn Tyrant, something with the ETB, you probably want the more efficient reanimation in Zombify, but there are some shenanigans for this card. Like in Standard, imagine reanimating a Herald of Eternal Dawn. We just played this for Against the Odds like a couple of months ago. It's our new Platinum Angel, making it so you can't lose the game, your opponents can't win the game. If you Perennation this, it's going to be really hard to die. Sure, there's a couple of things that can get out from under it, an Edict or like specifically Sunfall, but some decks are just straight up not going to be able to deal with this card. Not only does it not die to sweepers, other than Sunfall, Sons of Exiles, you can't even target it, so you can't discount it, you can't go for the throat it. It's likely to stick around forever. So this is going to be one of the first decks I try to build, is Perennation to reanimate Herald of Eternal Dawn, but even just think of a Shieldred, like a Shieldred with hexproof and indestructible, so it's just going to sit on the battlefield. It's just a 4-drop, but it's likely going to win you the game. So those are kind of the shenanigans you're looking for with Perennation. As I mentioned before, in Standard, there are a few ways around this. It's basically Sunfall and then Edicts. A Shieldred's Edict, a Liliana, and even the Edicts you can kind of play around by getting an extra creature or two on the battlefield. So in a lot of ways, this thing's just never going to die once you reanimate it. Once you get back to older formats, that's where things get a little bit weird. So in Commander, we have Reanimate, we have Animate Dead, we have Necromancy, we have really cheap, efficient reanimation. So if you're just playing like some Entomb Reanimated Creature style deck, I don't think you're playing Perennation. You're sticking with the cheaper, more efficient, more explosive style of reanimation. But there are some shenanigans for Perennation there as well. So we already talked about Platinum Angel effects. Like reanimating one of them in Commander is absolutely absurd. Sure, someone could have a Farewell, someone could have a Sunfall effect, but really, this might just straight up win you the game. Or imagine like Children Whispering one, or if you want to be really mean, Vorinclex Voice of Hunger. With Indestructible and Hexproof, your opponents are going to be so incredibly annoyed. But by far the meanest, and maybe the best trick for Perennation, is using it with artifacts that blow up the battlefield. So the classic example of this is Nev's Disc. So 4 mana for an artifact, enters tapped, you pay 1 and tap it to destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. So when Wizards made this card 30 years ago, they assumed, well, you activate the Nev's Disc, it's a one-shot because it's an artifact, so it's going to blow itself up. But if your Nev's Disc is indestructible because you reanimate it with Perennation, then you can just blow up the board every single turn for 1 mana because your Nev's Disc isn't going to blow itself up. You can do the same trick with Cohesive Portal, although it takes a little bit of voting to go in your way. Although, worst case, you get to draw an extra card each turn. Boom Pile, same trick for all non-land permanents, except you got to win a coin flip. So this seems absolutely brutal. Like, Nev's Disc being reanimated with Perennation, it probably just wins the game. Like, who's going to want to keep playing when their board gets Wrath every single turn? I'm sure Krim is going to do this on, like, the first available Commander Clash. It sounds like something Krim would do, but it does seem absolutely brutal. The only downside I see of this card in Commander, well, the second downside, we did talk about how 6 mana is a lot for Reanimation compared to, like, Reanimate or Animate Dead. But the other downside is it is a 3-color card, which just kind of minimizes the number of decks that can play it. Like, if you want to be a Reanimation deck that's also Abzan, you got like Cardor, Ghost Chieftain, I guess Anakthea, although that's really kind of an enchantment reanimator deck, Nethroi. So all this to say, there's going to be decks where you would want to play this, but you're not going to be able to just because it's an Abzan card. But in an Abzan deck with graveyard synergies, this card seems absolutely busted. So Perennation, I know 6 mana, it's a lot compared to like a Reanimate or something, but Hexproof and Indestructible opens up so many sweet shenanigans that this is probably my favorite reanimation spell of all time and one of the coolest cards from the entire set. We also got a new Abzan 3-drop in Severance Priest. So this card, 3 mana Abzan 3/3 Jin Cleric. It has Death Touch, so 3 mana 3/3 Death Touch, not bad. It says when this creature enters, target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, exile that card. And then it says when this creature leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates a XX weight spirit creature token where X is the mana value of the exiled card. So Severance Priest, honestly, I'm not really sold on this card. So 3 mana 3/3 Death Touch, that part's good, even though 3 colors is kind of a big ask, but I don't think its ability is actually that strong. So I've seen comparisons that this is like a Vendilion Click or a Thought-Knot Seer, and I'm not sure those are actually great comparisons. I see where people are going with this. It's a creature that comes and takes a card out of your opponent's hand and then gives something back once it leaves the battlefield or once it dies. Vendilion Click, Thought-Knot Seer, the difference is you give your opponent a random card, right? You take your opponent's best card and they get a random card. Severance Priest, when it leaves the battlefield, you're going to give your opponent a creature for free, which means this is actually really a Skyclave Apparition, but instead of exiling a permanent from the battlefield, it exiles a card from your opponent's hand. And this is why I think Severance Priest is not actually a very good card. And the reason here is tempo. So if you think about why Skyclave Apparition was very, very good, and it still is pretty good, your opponent plays something, they spend 2, 3, 4 mana on that thing, and then Skyclave Apparition answers that thing. It's gone temporarily, and then once Skyclave Apparition leaves the battlefield, your opponent's going to get the token, which is going to be downgraded compared to what you exiled. So your opponent spends some mana, and they end up getting a worse version of their thing. With Severance Priest, the issue I have here is tempo, because your opponent's not spending any mana. Because you're taking the card from your hand, your opponent's never investing any mana to put that on the battlefield, and then when Severance Priest leaves the battlefield, your opponent's going to get a free 3/3, 4/4, 5/5, 10/10 in the worst case scenario for no mana at all. So that's the part that concerns me about this card. I don't know if I really want to be giving my opponent a free, potentially big creature for just playing the game of Magic. Is a Thoughtseize on a 3/3 Death Touch body actually worth the downside of giving your opponent a big thing when Severance Priest leaves the battlefield? That's what I'm not exactly sold on. And plus, when you look at a card like this, what do you most often want to take out of your opponent's hand? A lot of times, if you're playing a creature that's going to be able to do the Thoughtseize thing, you're trying to time it to get rid of the Wrath, to protect the rest of your board. So you're trying to snag the Sunfall, or the Day of Judgment, or maybe your opponent's a combo deck, and you're trying to get rid of the Perennation that's going to reanimate the Platinum Angel or whatever. In these situations, the token that your opponent gets is going to be a 4/4, a 5/5, or a 6/6. A free 5/5 or 6/6, that is a lot of value. Remember, people don't play cards like Generous Gift in Constructed because they give your opponent a 3/3. This is potentially giving your opponent something way better. And remember, like we talked about before, they never even spent the mana on that thing. At least with Beastwood, then your opponent invests mana and you turn it into a 3/3. There's no investment on your opponent's part. Let's talk about the good news, though. It's not all bad news with Severance Priest, even though I'm not sold on this card being good. So good news number one, 3/3 Death Touch, actually a pretty good body, so I can get behind that. It's also much better if you're exiling small things. Maybe you're exiling a Hopeless Nightmare, a Fear of Isolation against the self-bounce decks. Then this is actually not that bad, right? Even if it leaves the battlefield, your opponent's getting what? A 1/1, a 2/2. We can deal with that. It's also better against combo decks. If you look at Standard and you're up against like the Omniscience Reanimator deck, combo decks tend to be light on interaction, so your ability to play this and have it stick and never give your opponent the token is actually pretty high. Obviously, if you take the Omniscience and then your opponent does find a removal spell and they get a 10/10, you might die to your Severance Priest, giving your opponent such a big creature, but still against combo it gets even better. The same is true in older formats. If you're up against a Storm deck or Grinding Station combo, any sort of combo deck that isn't really trying to interact with your board, then I think this goes up in value. Also worth mentioning in older formats, it's cheap enough for Collected Company, it works with Green Sun Zenith, and there are some shenanigans here. This is a shenanigan that if you've been playing Magic for a long time, you probably already know, but it's one that Wizards has mostly removed from the game in recent years. So the trick here is blinking Severance Priest with its Enters trigger on the stack. So you could like play this and then Ether Violin of Flicker Wisp or cast an Ephemerate. So what happens if you play Severance Priest and blink it before its Enters trigger resolves is you're going to stack the triggers in a weird way where it leaves the battlefield trigger to make the big token is going to resolve first, and then its Enters the battlefield trigger is going to resolve after, which means you essentially get to exile something for free without giving your opponent a token. So that's something to keep in mind if you're playing some sort of blink deck. It does go up a little bit more in value as well. So Severance Priest, honestly, I love Abzan, but I'm skeptical of this one. I just can't get over the giving your opponent so much free value. If they had to invest the mana in the card like Skyclave, I would totally be behind this. But the fact that your opponent doesn't have to spend any mana, I feel like this is just going to be too big of a tempo loss. But I hope the card actually makes it because I love Abzan, and it is a pretty sweet idea, even if I think the actual wording on the card might keep it from being too strong. We also got a land cycle, and surprisingly, it's not a dual land cycle. I was fully convinced that we're going to be getting some sort of dual land cycle to help make the 3-color wedges work. Instead, we have a rare land cycle of utility lands, which does kind of care about being in wedges, but not in the way you'd probably think. So for example, we have Kishla Village, the green member of the cycle, and we're going to go through all these individually, but it's a land. It enters tapped unless you control an island or a swamp. So you can play it in any deck, and it's worth mentioning with these, because they only have one color of mana symbol on them, you could play Kishla Village in a mono green deck in Commander. Even though it says island and swamp, it's got no mana symbols on it. So you can play it in a mono green deck. Gonna be better if you're a Sultai deck, because then it's gonna come into play tapped. And then its ability is make a colored mana, green in this case, or you can pay for tap it to surveil too. So that's kind of the setup for these lands. And I will say, I think all of these lands are playable to some extent. None of them are bad. Like, in the right deck, they're going to come into play untapped. They're going to give you some extra value. They even make colored mana, which is rare on utility lands. So I think this cycle is actually very good, although some of them are stronger than others. So Kishla Village itself, I think, is actually one of the weaker members of the cycle. So it's 4 mana and tapping it to surveil 2, which means you're essentially playing 5 mana to surveil 2, which is a pretty big number, especially when we're used to surveilling for free with the surveil lands when they enter, even though they do enter tapped. And we even have like Lilypad Village, which is 1 blue and tapped to surveil 2, but you need a bird, a frog, an otter, a rat to enter to even activate it. So I don't think Kishla Village is horrible or anything. I can see playing a copy in a deck, especially one that cares about getting cards into the graveyard, but to me this looks like a utility land that you really hope you don't have to activate. It's one of those cards where if you're activating this, things probably went really poorly because you didn't have anything better to spend your 5 mana on. So it's one of those cards that sure, a copy or two in your Sultai graveyard deck is probably fine. It makes colored mana. It's often going to come into play on tap, so it's kind of replacing a basic forest in the deck. So the cost of putting it in your deck seems very, very low, but I do think it's one that you're probably not going to want to activate the ability on very often. We also got Great Asherin City. This is the black member of the cycle. So this is an Abzan land. It enters tapped unless you control a forest or a plains. It makes a black mana, and then you can pay 2 and tap it, exile a creature card from your graveyard, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token. So this one, we actually have a pretty easy comparison to in Moorland Haunt from way back in original Innistrad. So Moorland Haunt was pay a white and a blue, tap it, exile a creature from your graveyard to make a 1/1 spirit creature token with flying. So the downside is the spirit loses flying compared to Moorland Haunt. The upside is you only need 1 color. You needed 2 color for Moorland Haunt, and Great Asherin City actually makes colored mana, which is a pretty big upgrade. So I think this card is actually pretty good. When you consider that the going rate for making a token on a land, we have a Fountain Port is 3 mana and tap in a life, Castle Ardenvale 4 mana and tap it. It's actually a pretty efficient rate. The only thing I'd say about this card is you just got to keep in mind, if you're planning on using your graveyard, it gets a little bit awkward. If you're a Gix's Command deck or a Mosswood Dread Knight deck, there's some cards you don't really want to be exiling from your graveyard because you want to be getting them back from your graveyard. So just keep that in mind. Moorland Haunt was really good back in its day in Spirit decks. The Spirit decks didn't use their graveyard at all. So it's just kind of free value. Like you can make on-type creatures for a cheap price and use this resource that you were essentially letting go to waste, which was your graveyard. Great Asherin City and Abzan, it is the color of reanimation in the set. We're just looking at Perennation. So keep that in mind. If you're planning on using your graveyard, you might not really be able to play this card, but if you're an Abzan deck or a token deck that doesn't care about your graveyard, maybe you're playing Elspeth Stormslayer to double your tokens or Mondrag to double your tokens, then Great Asherin City seems very, very strong. We also got the red member of the cycle, Quarry Mountain Monastery. So this is the Jeskai land. Enters tapped unless you control a plains or an island. It taps for a red, and then you can pay 4 tap it to exile the top card of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play that card. So essentially 5 mana, because you got to tap the land itself, to impulse draw. And this card, it seems fine. I mean, Castle Lochwain is what? 3 in tap, and you lose some life to draw a card. Bonder's Enclave, 3 in tap, plus you need a creature power 4 or greater. Arch Varaska, 5 in tap to draw a card. So 4 in tap to impulse draw seems about the right rate. This is another card that's kind of like the green one, where this is a great card to activate when you have nothing else to do. You put this in your deck hoping that you never have to activate it because you're going to have other things to do with your mana. But if you find yourself empty-handed or you're desperately digging for a removal spell or something, this does get the job done. And it goes up even more in value if you're playing Prosper or whatever. We needed a good and Prosper card for this set. But if you actively care about playing things from exile because you're Rocco or Feldorn or Prosper, or in Standard we got Quintorius Khan, Pia Nalar, that's where I think Quarry Mountain Monastery is going to be at its best. We also got the white member of the cycle, which I think is sneakily one of the strongest members of the cycle, Delkoven Encampment. So this is a Mardu land. It enters tapped unless you control a swamp or a mountain. It makes a white mana, and then you can pay 2 and tap it. And whenever you attack this turn, you create 2 1/1 red warrior creature tokens that are tapped and are attacking, and you sack them at the beginning of the next end step. So the more I thought about this card, the more I realized this is essentially a creature land that gets around one of the big downsides of creature lands, which is you often don't want to activate them if your opponent has mana up, because you don't really want to turn your opponent's cut down or whatever into land destruction. Delkoven Encampment gets around this because you're not actually turning your land into a creature. Instead, you just get to make 2 1/1, so it's adding essentially 2 hasty power to the battlefield. The only downside I see to this card is you don't need another creature on the battlefield. So unlike other creature lands, which are at their best as Wrath Protection, where your opponent like Sunfalls your board board and you're like, okay, well, I got a creature land, I can hit you for some damage post-wrath. This isn't going to do that because you need another creature to attack with to actually make it happen. But 3 and tap to essentially get into damage and maybe get some synergies out of like sacrifice effects, things dying, token synergies, actually seems pretty reasonable to me. So this seems at its best, and maybe the War Leader's Call decks, the Boros Convoke decks, the Jeskai Convoke decks, where you can really take advantage of these 2/1/1s by having War Leader's Call to make them bigger and deal damage when they enter, or Sanguine Evangelist, they grow your Regal Bunnycorn. So I think there's certainly going to be homes for this card, and I expect it to actually be pretty powerful. Finally, we have the scariest member of the cycle, especially for non-standard formats, in Mistrise Village. So Mistrise Village, this is the Teamer land. It enters tapped unless you control a mountain or a forest. You can pay, make a blue mana with it, or you can pay a single blue and tap it to make the next spell you cast this turn uncounterable. So this is essentially a twist on Beseiju Who Shelters All, which could make an instant or sorcery spell uncounterable. The twist here is this makes any spell uncounterable for 2 extra mana. So in standard, I don't think this card is actually going to be that heavily played. Like, if you're in Teamer and it's coming to play untapped, it's fine. I could see like Domain Overlords play a copy of this, and then you know your whatever big finisher's gonna resolve when you want it to resolve. But I think in general, we already got Cavern in standard, so if you're trying to resolve creatures, that's probably just gonna be better. But I think this card is really designed to shake up older formats. So what do we do with this card in older formats? The answer is this is for resolving your combos. If you have a game-winning combo and you just want to make sure that that resolves, because if it does resolve, you're gonna win the game. That's where I think this card can be very good. Similar to what we see with Beseiju, so like Show and Tell decks in Legacy, Through the Breach decks, or Calibrated Blast decks in Modern. That's where I think we're going to see the power of Mistrise Village. The other interesting aspect of this card is compared to Beseiju, Beseiju is very bad as a fair card, because every time you tap it, whether you're actually using its uncounterable ability or not, you have to take 2 damage. You can't really play it in fair decks. If you're just playing like a control deck, you don't ever want to play Beseiju, because it's just going to kill you as you're casting your random stuff. Mistrise Village, though, since it makes blue mana, and it's often going to come into play untapped, I think you could potentially play this in a fair deck. Maybe you're playing a control deck, and you want to stop the combo deck. Maybe you can use Mistrise Village to make sure your counter spell, or your Force of Will, is going to actually be able to stop the Through the Breach, even if your opponent has a counter spell to try to win a counter war. I also think that this is pretty much an ultra staple in Commander. I love my utility lands in Commander. This one makes colored mana. It's usually going to come into play untapped. Well, not usually. It depends on the deck you're playing. In some color combinations, it's usually going to come into play untapped. But being able to pay 2 extra mana to make sure that your Farewell resolves when you need it to, or to make sure your Mana Geyser resolves so you have your big turn and win the game, or that your Thassa's Oracle resolves so you literally win the game, I think that makes this a really, really good card for Commander. And unlike Beseiju, remember, this works for any spell that you cast. It's not just instants and sorceries, which is another interesting twist there. So I think I would play this in a lot of Commander decks. No one likes getting their stuff countered, and making sure you can resolve your big finisher when you need to is actually very, very powerful. So all in all, I think this land cycle is actually very strong. As I said before, some are better than others, and I was definitely expecting a rare dual land cycle just to kind of make the wedge mana work, but I think these cards are all very powerful. I expect that they will definitely see play in standard, and some of them, especially like Mistrise Village, might be even better in older formats. We also got a new Zurgo in Zurgo Thunder's Decree. So a 3-mana Mardu 2/4. It's a legendary orc warrior. It has Mobilize 2, so when it attacks, you get 2 1/1 red warrior creature tokens that are tapped and attacking, and you stack them on the next end step, except if you have Zurgo, you don't stack them on the next end step, because its static ability is, during your end step, warrior tokens you control have this token can't be sacrificed. So just to clarify how this works, let's say you play Zurgo, and you attack with Zurgo, you make a couple of warrior tokens, you go to your end step, they survive, and then the next turn, maybe your opponent kills the Zurgo. Do you have to sacrifice those tokens on the next end step? The answer is no. It's a one-shot trigger with those tokens, so as long as they survive, survive one end step. They're going to survive forever, just like a real creature. And I actually think this Zurgo might be pretty strong. If you think about what this is, it's essentially got Preacher of the Schism stats, but it's way better than that because it's going to make these 2 hasty tokens that are tapped and attacking whenever it attacks, which kind of means it's like a 3-mana Hero of Bladehold almost, or a 3-mana Leonin War Leader. It's a card that can deal a lot of damage, and it seems built to be in some sort of mobilized deck. Because remember, not only do the mobilized tokens that Zurgo makes stick around, but any warrior tokens are not going to be sacrificed on your end step. So we haven't seen a ton of mobilized stuff yet, but if there's enough to actually build a mobilized deck where you just stack up a whole bunch of things with mobilized, and then you also play Nirev, because Nirev's going to take advantage of those tokens having entered the battlefield this turn and double their damage, you might actually have a pretty sweet mobilized deck with Zurgo being at the center of it. The other trick you can do with this card, and honestly, this is probably either against the odds or commander shenanigans, but you can use cards that make token copies of creatures until the end of turn, like Molten Duplication or Calamity Galloping Inferno, to make copies of bigger, badder warriors, like Railway Brawler, let's say, and have those stick around, because it's going to give any warrior tokens you control that ability. So if you make a token copy of a Railway Brawler with Molten Duplication, you don't actually have to sack it on your end step. You get to keep it forever, which seems like a really fun way to build around this card. Probably too many hoops to jump through to really be like a competitive standard deck or anything, but at least seems like a super funny way to build around this card in Commander. So Zurgo actually seems pretty good. We'll have to see just how good the mobilized mechanic is, but as a mini Hero of Bladehold with a pretty good base body, I actually think this card could definitely see some standard play. The question with all these wedge cards is going to be, how good is the wedge? Like, for Zurgo to be good, we need some sort of mobilizing Mardu deck to be good, and at this point it's just too early in spoiler season to really tell, but I think just in a vacuum, this seems like a card that should be pretty pplayable. We also got a hilarious new Jeskai spell in the new way, and this card I'm pretty sure is very bad, but my god can I not wait to build a deck around it, because it's going to lead to some super funny moments. So the new way, 5-mana Jeskai instant, it says the next time a sorcerer of your choice would deal damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. When damage is prevented this way, it deals that much damage to the source's controller, and you draw that many cards. I should say this is an unofficial translation. For some reason it doesn't say this turn on it, although I'm like 99.999% sure it actually is going to say this turn on it, because we never had a card in Magic that like tracked when something would deal damage many turns in the future. So anyway, the new way, if this sounds familiar, it's essentially Deflecting Palm. They cost a bunch more mana, but when you prevent the damage, you don't just dome your opponent for a bunch, you also get to draw a ton of cards. So Deflecting Palm is actually a pretty good card. If you're getting attacked by one big creature, it's actually one of the scariest cards in Magic. You're getting attacked by a 15/15 Emrakul. You Deflecting Palm, instead of your opponent takes 15, you take 0. Now with the new way, if you do that same thing, not only does your opponent take the 15, you're going to draw 15 cards, which is ridiculous. So this is a card that I think is actually not especially good. It's just too much mana. Like, how do you leave up 5 mana for this? If it's going to have a chance, it's going to be in some sort of draw-go style control deck. And even then, I'm a little skeptical, because I feel like this is a card where the ceiling is unbelievably high. It might have the highest ceiling of any card in the set. The ceiling of this card is, I'm about to lose the game, but instead you lose the game for 5 mana. I'm about to lose the game, but instead you take a ton of damage, I draw a new hand, I go on to win the game. That's the ceiling. The problem is the floor of this card is very low. It's going to be incredibly situation and matchup dependent. It's one of those cards that when it works, you're going to feel like a genius, but it's probably not going to work a super high percentage of the time. So the dream is, you're playing in Standard, you're playing a control deck, your opponent is playing the Dirty Mouse deck, and they have Heartfire Hero, and they have Manifold Mouse, and they cast a bunch of Monstrous Rages, and they attack you with this like 10/10 double striking Heartfire Hero, and you're like, new way? Prevent the damage, you take the damage, I draw a ton of cards. That's the dream of this card. The problem is, like I said before, it is incredibly matchup dependent. It works pretty well against an opponent that's looking to attack you with one super big thing. Obviously, like Jumbo Cactar. Your opponent goes to attack you with the Jumbo Cactar, and you're like, new way? You take 10,000 instead of me. Although, I guess, actually, that would just draw the game, because you would draw 10,000 cards. So unless you're playing 10,000 card Battle of Wits, you probably die too. But that kind of situation, if you're getting attacked by one big creature, this is actually incredibly powerful. It's going to be deal a ton of damage, you don't take a ton of damage, and you refill your hand. On the other hand, if you're playing against Boros Convoke or some go wide style aggro deck, or even like a mid-rangey deck that's playing a bunch of 2/2s and 3/3s, if this is 5 mana, prevent 2 or 3 damage, you draw 2 or 3 cards, that's just not really worth it. It's going to be really, really difficult to actually find the places for this card to work. So I think it's going to be hard to put in most decks, just because in some matchups it's going to be the worst card in your deck, while in other matchups it might be the best card in your deck. So maybe it's like a sideboard card. The thing I love about this card though is it's just going to lead to amazing moment. So I definitely am planning on building a deck around this card. Like, just this card existing, if anyone plays it, it's gonna make people really nervous to attack into a bunch of open mana, because things can go really, really wrong now that the new way exists. As far as Commander is concerned, I think the same thing is true. I view this card very much like I view Ink Shield, which is Ink Shield. Some people love Ink Shield. The idea of like, I'm going to fog all this damage and I'm going to make a million 2/1s and I'm going to kill you with the 2/1s. When it works, you just feel so smart. Like you pulled off the completion of the world's greatest puzzle and you're like a god of magic. So when it works, you feel incredibly smart. The problem is leaving up 5 mana is really, really rough, because what if the opponents don't attack you that turn? Or what if they're like, 5 mana, that could be an Ink Shield. Maybe I'll only attack with some of my creatures. So it's very easy to play around, and leaving up 5 mana a turn for a card that you may or may not cast is a huge cost. That's a huge loss of tempo. So I think the same is true of New Way. Like, there's going to be moments where you get someone with this, and it's going to be the greatest thing ever. But I think in the average game, it's probably not a card that, from a win percentage, I'm trying to, get first place as much as possible perspective, is actually going to be a good card to have in your deck. Because you have the same problem, right? Like, against one big creature, it's great. Against a wide board of small creatures, it's not that great. Even against a wide board of big creatures, like your opponent plays a Crater Hoof and their entire team is huge. Yeah, preventing the damage from one source, I guess, is kind of funny. You can maybe reverse it and, like, hit your opponent for some damage, but you're probably still going to die. So the New Way, this might be one of my favorite bad cards in the set. Like, I think the card's very bad. It's just too much mana, but the moments it's going to generate are so incredibly cool that I can't wait to build a deck around it. So probably not a good card, but a super fun, ridiculous card. In the world of lower rarity cards, not a ton to look at today, and check out everything over at MTGPreviews.com. Probably the best of this bunch is Descendant of the Storms, which could actually be a playable card. 1 mana 2/1, Human Soldier. When it attacks, you can pay 2. If you do, you endure 1. So you either put a counter on it or you get to make a 1/1. We had Usher of the Fallen in Standard not that long ago, and it was essentially the same exact card, except it had the Boast ability, which works almost exactly like pay 2 when you attack. And that card saw play in aggro decks in Standard. So this could be a 1-drop that we see show up in some of the aggro decks, maybe the Convoke style deck. So I think it's close to being playable. The other two mostly seem like limited fodder. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers for today. So what do you think of the land cycle? How ridiculous is that Abzan reanimation spell? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow with even more Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? We can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe check out yesterday's Against the Odds, where we look to push it to the limit in Standard.